Hi, I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. Welcome to Freethought Matters, produced by the Freedom from Religion Foundation. We are a national association of freethinkers working to keep church and state separate. Join us today at FFRF.org.
Amit Paul, the Director of Communications at the Freedom from Religion Foundation, recently had the opportunity to interview the New York Times' newest columnist, author and journalist Michelle Goldberg at FFRF's National Convention last fall. Michelle Goldberg's been sounding the alarm for more than 10 years about the rise of the Christian nationalist movement.
11 years ago, I published a book called Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, which was about a kind of then ascendant, authoritarian, fundamentalist movement in American politics. And I'm going to start by quoting something I wrote in that book. I wrote, "America is full of good people, but something dark is loose. There's a free-floating anxiety that easily metastasizes into paranoia and hatred for the same enemies always targeted by authoritarian populist movements: homosexuals, urbanites, foreigners, intellectuals, and religious minorities. Rationality is losing its hold, empirical evidence is discounted as the product of a secular worldview or a scheming liberal elite. Democracy suffocates in this atmosphere, and space opens up for something else to supplant it."
Congratulations on being chosen as a New York Times columnist.
Thank you.
And we are also excited at the FFRF office. So can you tell us your reaction and, what all do you hope to write about?
I mean, obviously it was a dream come true, and I am, to be honest, still staggered by it. What I hope to write about, in some ways it's obviously hard to predict, right? But I imagine that much of the thrust of the column is going to be arguing about and trying to figure out this strange and terrible new post-apocalyptic world that we're living in after the election of Donald Trump, when all of my most cherished assumptions about what's possible in American politics, the steadiness of our institutions, the limits to authoritarianism in American life, all of these things have been blown up. The kind of fundamental nature of modern America as a liberal, classically liberal, multicultural country is now sort of under sustained attack from the highest levels of government. And so, to me, the column is a place to both to speak, and occasionally for people who just cannot believe where we are right now, and to speak to their sense of incredulity and horror, and also try to puzzle out where we are and to, if not chart a way forward, maybe to examine some of the people who are trying to chart a way forward.
Can you talk a bit about your background and your early work? You've, of course, written for a range of publications from The Nation to Salon. How you got started in journalism?
Sure. Well, I've actually never really done anything else besides journalism. I went to journalism school. I graduated college when I was 20, went right to journalism school, had my first job in journalism in California when I was 22, and have been so fortunate to never really have to do anything else as an adult, because I'm not really capable of doing anything else. For the last, I've been a political journalist for the last, 15 years maybe. I'm trying to go back and think. I started out, one of my first jobs in journalism was at Salon. My experiences in covering the 2004 election when John Kerry was running against George W. Bush, those informed my first book, which was Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism. I remember being in Ohio, and a lot of us in New York had assumed that the election was going to be a referendum on the Iraq War. I remember going to all of these mega churches in Ohio where so much political organizing was taking place and so much unbelievable demagoguery about gay marriage and, kind of saving the country from Sodom. And, people stood standing up and cheering, and I was thinking, this is really serious. And where I live, or the people I know, we're just not seeing this. And that sort of became the germ of Kingdom Coming, which came out in 2006.
You've preempted me a bit by mentioning your book, Kingdom Coming. I had the pleasure of reading both your books in preparation for this interview. Can you talk a bit about the themes that you deal with in the book? You deal with women's rights, homophobia, evolution, the teaching of evolution, the court system. Can you touch a bit on all of these?
The broad theme of that book is about what I call in that book Christian nationalism, which at the time was this sort of right-wing populist, religious, authoritarian movement that basically saw kind of Christian America or Christian men as having been dethroned from their proper role in shaping and leading American culture, and was very aggressive and optimistic about what they would sometimes call taking the land, retaking every aspect of American culture. And so the belief was that Christianity and their particular interpretation of Christianity should form the basis of every single aspect of American life, from the court system. I mean, you could find whole books about the proper biblical tax code, the proper biblical marginal tax rate, but that it should also govern the teaching of science, that it should really be a guide to the whole of reality and the whole of social organization. And at that time, they had been working for, I guess, since the 70s within the Republican Party, had slowly sort of taken over the Republican Party from the grassroots building on up. And in the administration of George W. Bush, they had enormous influence, and you kind of started to see federal power being deployed on behalf of this ideology. And it's interesting because in some ways, that book was very anxious about this authoritarian strain in American life and on the American right. And it came out, and there was, the book was well received in some quarters, and other people said that it was really hysterical and alarmist. And I remember not knowing whether or not they were right? You kind of write a book and you try to explain what you're seeing and where you see things going, but you never know if you're right or not, if you're being overwrought. And so for a long time, I kind of wasn't sure about the criticisms of the book. And I think when I go back and read the book now, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, the shape of authoritarianism in America has taken in a lot of ways, is very different than what I foresaw in that book. But the kind of collapse of secular liberal institutions in the face of this onslaught and the power of this authoritarian populism, in some ways that has surpassed my worst fears from that book.
Yes, the thought I had constantly in my mind while reading the book is that the book is so prescient, even prophetic, if I may use the word. And it's screaming for an update. Maybe I'm putting you on the spot. And you're talking about, actually, this afternoon, Trump and Christian nationalism.
I spent a lot of time reporting on the Trump campaign. I was in Iowa during the caucuses when you saw a lot of the religious right mobilizing to try and stop him, mobilizing to try and get Ted Cruz in there instead. But I actually think that the relationship between Donald Trump and the religious right very quickly coalesced behind him once he won the nomination, and has now become really the bulwark of his support. When everyone else fades away, you still have this, 35% disproportionately white conservative evangelicals who are loyal to this president. White evangelicals actually voted for Trump in higher numbers, or at least higher percentages, than they voted for George W. Bush. And you think, how can that be? There's hypocrisy there, but there's also something more. I think his movement and the Christian right have more in common than it might immediately be clear. And the beginning of that, it lies with race.
So in some ways, it's really a paradox because, I never would have predicted in a million years when I was writing that book that the person that would lead this movement to glory would be the least devout president probably that we've ever had. Certainly the least, the least pious, certainly the most kind of flagrantly immoral, I think by secular as well as religious standards. And so in some ways, this is a real paradox. But in other ways, having written that book has really helped me to better understand why the Christian right has lined up so much behind him and has really been his strongest supporters. Because the modern Christian right, well, first of all, it comes out of white Southern segregationist culture. Something that historians of the Christian right point out is that according to the movement's own mythology, it was spurred to action by outrage over Roe versus Wade, but that's not really true. Before Roe versus Wade, the movement really got its start in opposition to the IRS revoking the tax-exempt status of the Southern Christian segregation academies. These Christian schools that had been set up to let parents avoid integrated schools in the South and whites-only Christian schools. And there's always been that kind of white nationalist strain in the movement, although by the time I was writing about it, there was a lot of shame about those origins and a lot of attempt to kind of repent and cast them off, but they were still always there, and they've since come roaring back.
And so the Christian right has always had a sort of strange, contradictory relationship with race. Its roots lie in Confederate nostalgia and Southern identity politics. But when I was writing Kingdom Coming during the administration of George W. Bush, there was a very conscious effort to apologize for that past, to repent that past. There was an understanding that it was embarrassing. You used to see there would be these ceremonies where white pastors would get on their knees before African American and Latino pastors and, beg forgiveness for the sin of racism. And then they would all join hands against the gays. And so, but I think what happened was that, Ralph Reed wrote about, the movement having to basically face the fact that it was on the wrong side of the civil rights struggle. What happened is that in 2008, we had a black president, and suddenly a lot of that racial reconciliation language and work went by the wayside. And the white resentment that had been key to the movement since its very beginning came roaring back to the fore. So that mapped very easily onto Donald Trump's movement.
And there was also always this strain of intense paranoia and conspiracy thinking in the movement, right? They talked a lot about the New World Order, the Trilateral Commission, these, sinister elites that were out to sabotage the wishes of the quote-unquote common man. Sometimes people would often, talk to me very darkly about Jewish financial power. And so all of those themes that have always underlined a lot of the works of the movement have obviously very much powered the rise of Donald Trump. And so there's more overlap in their worldview than I think you would at first imagine. And then of course, but then there's another piece of it, which is that the movement that I wrote about in 11 years ago was very optimistic. It believed that it was on the cusp of victory. Generation Joshua, the idea being that it was about to retake everything. And I think the movement has since, in a lot of ways, become much more defensive, it was obsessed with its own sense of victimization then, but that has been, redoubled since then. They see themselves, there's a lot of paranoia about, Christians being rounded up, Christianity being criminalized. And so that sense of intense victimization and crisis and kind of near, apocalyptic, that apocalyptic thinking has made them much more willing to kind of do whatever it takes, to justify whatever it takes, you know. So it's not hard for them to justify lining up behind this like profane, thrice married, you know, the first president to ever appear in a softcore porn film, because to them the situation is just that dire.
Your other book, The Means of Reproduction, also speaks so amazingly to our times. It's an incredible reporting endeavor surveying globally reproductive rights and policy. There's a short section, for example, on this forced sterilization program in India in the mid-1970s, which I lived through as a child. I was 5 or 6 then, and remember hearing about that and the awful effects it had. Can you talk about the book and how it sort of, you know, comments on our current predicament and our current times?
Well, sure. I mean, actually, in some ways that book, although maybe it's not clear on the surface, in some ways that book emerged from Kingdom Coming, because one of the things I saw towards the end of my reporting on Kingdom Coming is how the right was becoming international, was forging links all around the world, and you started to see the anti-abortion movement globalizing, you know, the kind of anti-gay rights movement globalizing. And it was in response or in tandem with the kind of globalization of the movement for women's rights. You had all over the world women's rights movements linking up, kind of increasingly trying to circumvent their own governments by going to international bodies or relying on kind of international human rights treaties. And so you had this, you know, I mean, it was basically, it looked at reproduction because that was where a lot of these fights were being fought, but it was about the kind of global fight for women's rights, which in some way is a fight that's like always about modernity versus fundamentalism, right? Like every single fundamentalist movement, there's a reason why they typically go after women's rights first, because women's rights are, you know, the kind of growing equality of women is a kind of very predictable effect of modernity and secularization, and the desire to kind of force women back into their place, back into their home, you know, back into the kitchen. Almost every single fundamentalist movement does that.
And it's in its brief 6 months plus tenure in power, the Trump administration has made its mark even in the realm of global reproductive rights. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, that was one of the first things that it did. And so to some extent, what the administration has done is predictable, because every Republican administration since Reagan, it comes in, Reagan first promulgated the global gag rule, you know, which is this ruling that no federal funding can be, no American family planning funding can be used to support organizations that not just perform abortion, advocate for abortion law reform, you know, counsel women about the option of abortion in places where abortion is legal. And so this has been, you know, a football. Usually, like, Republicans immediately, Democrats always repeal it, Republicans reinstate it. So that, we kind of knew it was going to happen. What was striking about Trump, and I think it was as much a function of just complete disinterest as it was of fanaticism on his part. You know, I think he just let the staffers that were passionate about this do whatever they wanted, is he massively expanded it, you know, far beyond what George W. Bush ever would have done, to encompass all of American international health spending. And this is something that George W. Bush, like, very pointedly, it's I don't want to seem like I'm kind of lionizing George W. Bush in retrospect, right? He was a very bad president, but there's, you know, but Trump is so much worse that it casts him in something of a kind of sepia-toned light. But so George W. Bush would have never done this very precisely, because it was known at the time that it would have undermined his signature AIDS initiative, right? That there was no way, if you were auditing all of the, you know, if you were auditing these community health clinics that are providing antiretrovirals to make sure that nobody has ever counseled anyone about an abortion, that you couldn't do it. And, you know, Trump, of course, he doesn't care one way or the other. This is like a way to score some quick points with some of his supporters. And so that's happening. And he's defunded the UNFPA. He's taken a number of other steps to reduce women's rights and endanger their health abroad.
It's a long-time truism of Washington politics that personnel is policy. And the personnel in this administration are overwhelmingly very, very conservative Catholics or fundamentalist Christians who are using, various government departments to restrict funding to family planning providers, both here and abroad, to reinstitute funding for abstinence education, to launch attacks on the Johnson Amendment, which is the amendment that stops churches from basically turning themselves into political action committees. And so you see this, in the Justice Department, you've seen a turn away from enforcing discrimination against women and gay people and African Americans and religious minorities, and a turn towards investigating discrimination against white Christians. And so all this is happening, and in some ways it's extraordinarily strange. And that this would be happening under the administration of a president who is, among other things, the first American president that we know of to have appeared in a softcore porn film. The first American president who tried to negotiate a contract for his wife to appear nude in Playboy. The first American president to have owned a casino with a strip club in it. And so in some ways I feel like, there was parts of Kingdom Coming that have now come to fruition, and there were parts of it and there have been developments since then that I never in a million years could have foreseen, right?
From this perspective, the most fascinating thing to me has been this overt alignment of Steve Bannon, who of course has no longer the White House now, with a pre-reform Vatican and sort of, almost sort of a throwback to the 1950s. Can you talk a bit about this whole overt strain of Christian nationalism within the Trump White House?
Sure. I mean, I think that basically within the Trump White, well, there's a couple of different things. I mean, partly it's that Trump has enabled a lot of people who he's kind of smuggled them into government. He ran on Christian identity politics of a sort, in that Christians would be, you'll be able to say Merry Christmas again, and kind of Christians would once again have their proper place in the culture.
Donald Trump doesn't really keep his promises. He doesn't, he's not a loyal person, but but he does tend to like people who like him. And so he has, really tried to, I would say, obviously not remoralize American life, but he has elevated a kind of Christian identity politics, so that although he himself is not kind of a pious man, he does treat white Christians as having pride of place in this country. When he says over and over again, we're going to say Merry Christmas again in this country. I mean, that's what that's about, right? It's not we're going to, celebrate the lessons of Jesus Christ. I mean, it's kind of Merry Christmas as screw you. And, I've seen, where he says, we're going to protect and take care of Christian Americans. I've heard him say that over and over again. The idea being that these people have not previously had the authority and cultural respect that they deserve. Just as we've learned that a lot of the Republican Party never really cared about Paul Ryan's tax plans, I think we're learning that a lot of this movement maybe never really cared about having a sexually chaste leader, never really cared about the moral example of the leader, as much as they cared about having their power and authority and cultural primacy recognized. And that's really what Donald Trump does.
And he definitely ran on repealing the Johnson Amendment and giving churches much more scope for political activity. But, he didn't run on like banning abortion. He didn't run on keeping trans people out of the military. But because only the most sort of like radical people on the right glommed onto him, those people have all followed him into power and been able to, work within the institutions of government somewhat unfettered, at least where kind of bureaucratic policy and executive order is concerned, to advance their agenda however they want to. And then on the other hand, I think that you see, and Steve Bannon is a good example of this, there's increasingly a global far right that sees itself as defending the white West against the tides of kind of third world migrants, and that also blames secularism and liberalism for so weakening the West that it's vulnerable to these kind of hordes of poor foreigners. And so and Steve Bannon, I think, it's interesting because although he's, obviously very much a nationalist, in a lot of ways he has more ties to global movements than, many of his most kind of cosmopolitan antagonists.
You'll be working for the Times and doing other projects besides. Can you tell us what your upcoming projects will be?
Sure. Well, for now, this is a big job and will command all of my attention for the foreseeable future. I want to give it everything I have. I do have a book in mind. Hillary Clinton once said, I think it was in October before the election, she said, "I'm the only thing standing between you and the apocalypse." And I think she was right. And now we're in. So I had in mind a book called Post-Apocalypse, about basically what has happened to America, the rise of the resistance, but the very open question of whether that will be enough.
That was Michelle Goldberg, interviewed by guest host Amit Paul. Thanks for watching Freethought Matters. I'm Dan Barker.
I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor for the Freedom from Religion Foundation, inviting you to tune in next week for another edition of Freethought Matters.
Because Freethought matters.